follows the line that is already built in to the wood through its previous history of growth. So it's as though you've found the grain and then you're bending it to your purpose because you want to chop it up into pieces of such and such a size. Or if you're maybe building something more complicated, like working with an axe to build a boat or a door frame or something, again, you have to understand how the grain goes. You have to find the grain, but then you have to bend it to your own particular purpose. So whenever we encounter matter, Deleuze and Guattari insist, it is matter in movement, in flux, in variation. And the consequence, they go on to assert, is that this matter flow can only be followed. Now, what Deleuze and Guattari call matter flow, I would call material, and so I would recast their assertion as a simple rule of thumb, and that is to follow the materials. I don't mean following here in a simply passive sense of letting the materials lead you on and you just following on behind. I think of it more in the sense of, say, a hunter following a trail, which of course is very active. If you're pursuing game and you're following a trail, you're having to be looking all the time for signs and of where the animal's been and marks and spoor and so on. It's a very active kind of process, and it's that sort of following that I'm talking about, not following in the sense of passive subservience, but of active monitoring and carrying on. And to apply this rule, then, is to intervene in a world that we would imagine to be continually on the boil. And perhaps it could be compared to a huge kitchen, to get back to the culinary metaphor. There is a tendency, I think, in material culture studies in particular, to imagine the world, for particular reasons, either as a museum or as a department store. So it's full of these objects that one then has to try and understand, either from the point of view of a curator or somebody visiting the museum, or from the point of view as a potential consumer who might want to buy something from the store. But that's a very peculiar kind of world in the museum or the department store. It's somehow frozen. The real world we inhabit is one that is continually on the move, on the boil. And so perhaps we could liken it to a huge kitchen. In the kitchen, stuff is mixed in various combinations, generating new materials in the process, which will in turn become mixed with other ingredients in an endless process of transformation. To cook, containers have to be opened and their contents poured out. We have literally to take the lids off things. And rather than imposing form on matter, practitioners are engaged in bringing together diverse materials or redirecting their flow in the anticipation of what might emerge. This is, of course, what alchemists do as well. Put a whole lot of stuff you've collected into a cauldron, put it under the fire and see what happens and watch what's going on. It's what gardeners are trying to do in making some sort of order out of their garden and stopping it all turning into to a jungle. Now, following materials and learning movements both call for observation. But to observe is not so much to see what is out there as to watch what is going on. I often think that we would have a completely different set of ideas, a set of theories about vision and the visual if we used the word to watch rather than to see. And it's odd that everybody's talking about ways of seeing, but nobody much seems to be talking about ways of watching. But watching is really what we do when we're in the world looking at what's going on. To watch is to watch what is going on. So observation seeks not to represent the observed, but to participate with it in the same generative movement, coupling the movement of the observer's attention, might be visual, oral, haptic, olfactory, coupling the movement of the observer's attention with currents of environmental activity. So we're back with this kind of model. Here's the sensory awareness moving on, and here is the movement of materials that you're coupling that sensory awareness to. And I want to respond to much recent writing on the relations between persons and material objects, which has been guided by the thought that agency is not exclusive to persons, but distributed in interactive networks of persons and things. In supposing that persons and things are all there is, theorists of material culture have a habit of envisaging a world of entities that have already precipitated out from the currents, mixtures, and transmutations of substances from which they are formed. There's not much room in theories of material culture, for example, for the air, or indeed for many kinds of liquid. But to follow the materials is to enter into a world in formation in which things appear not as bounded objects that you can interact with, but as confluences of materials that have momentarily melded into recognizable forms. Human bodies, too, are confluences of materials that have momentarily melded into recognizable forms. And to understand human bodies, just like other kinds of things, you have to take the lids off. I always think that the closest analogy to a person is actually something like a compost heap. But if you take the lid off, there's all this stuff going on underneath. And that's where the life really is. But that's another story. So far from containing the materials of which they are formed, things generally leak and are only sustained because of the interchange of materials across their surfaces. And it's because of these fluxes, because materials are continually leaking across boundaries, that the inhabited world is imbued with life. There could be no life in a world in which everything was completely locked inside the forms of solid objects. So it does seem to me that the more that theorists have to say about agency, and they have an awful lot to say about it, the less they seem to have to say about life, something of which on the whole they're scared to mention at all. In shifting the focus from ready-made objects to processes of generation and dissolution, I think we should attend not to the materiality of things, but to materials becoming things. And that's to call into question rather than to assume the objectness of things. Objects exist, but things, if you will, everything is a going on, a confluence of flows and currents of materials. And I would maintain that to engage with things to engage with things is to sense the world, not to inhabit worlds of sense. It's precisely, I think, this engagement that is missing from an anthropology of the senses, which is currently very much on the ascendant, that has nothing to say about how people practically see, hear, and touch as they go about their business, but everything to say about how their experiences of seeing, hearing, and touching feed the imagination and infuse its discursive and literary expressions. We hear that people inhabit worlds of sense, as though out there, we inhabit a world with sounds and smells and feelings. We inhabit a world which we can then observe and follow through touching it, feeling it, watching, listening. But to suppose that the world we inhabit is comprised of sensory stimuli is, I think, to move back from there to that sort of model, to put the cart before the horse. In the very objectification of the senses, as things one can have an anthropological study of, it seems that the eyes, ears, and skin are no longer considered to be organs of a body that, as it makes its way in the world, attentively looks, listens, and feels where it's going. On the contrary, these organs, these eyes, ears, and skin, have become instruments of playback, capturing moments of experience and relaying them back to a reflexive consciousness for subsequent review and interpretation. This kind of logic is most evident in the field of visual culture, studies of visual culture, where scholars write about ways of seeing and how people learn to see, but then it turns out that seeing consists of looking at images, and that no